Hello and welcome to Ethics and Moral Problems. This is Dr. Stephen Bujno. This lecture is on human dignity, constructed or recognized. A continued conversation on our understanding of person as the qualitative aspect and distinct from the terms human and life, which we left as quantitative. So the goal here is first to ask, in essence, as to if we're going to speak about the human person as a source of dignity for all morality, then we'll have to say, is this dignity assigned to us by others or by some particular criteria or value, or is it simply recognized, something that was determined as a nature, and although perhaps named, certainly not something that was constructed. So the way that I want to do this is by offering two broad categories, natural and social kinds. If we look at natural kinds, these reflect the natural order of the world. So they are things that we, in a sense, discover, but we don't necessarily construct them. Now, this would be the elements, of course, lithium, but also perhaps something like human or even life. And it could be compounds, as in H2O, water. So we have simply discovered water. We gave it its name, and we distinguish it from other things that are not water. But nonetheless, we cannot simply say that water is now lead. We can maybe all agree universally that from now on we will always call what we normally know as H2O as lead, but nothing's changed. The nature of it is still there. Even things like vitamin C. So it could be something, of course, found in the natural world, but even things that are compounds that humans put together. Social kinds, on the other hand, these reflect the interests and the actions of the community that, in a sense, categorizes them. Money would be something that we would call a social kind. And we could also even see race there. Now, this doesn't mean that, say, in the medical professional field, that particular races and people that come from regions don't have a susceptibility or a genetic characteristic that may make them predisposed to a particular pathology. But nonetheless, these are categories that are determined by those of us that have interest in actions in the world. We might even say the gender expression. So if we leave sex as the biological aspect and then gender as a reflection, and say femininity and masculinity, there are aspects of that we will call constructed. Now I'm going to say something briefly about that because I want to make sure that I'm clear on a few things. First, swinging back to this idea of the natural kinds, we would call this an essentialist understanding. In other words, it is what the thing is. There's an essence to it. And what we do is we simply recognize the essence. The fact that we give it a name, we might call an apple, it doesn't matter what we call it. What is and that which makes it an apple will remain an apple. We can call it tomorrow a banana, we can call it tomorrow, a pitchfork. Just giving it a different name and placing it in a different category will never change anything about what is or is not an apple. The idea with social kinds and things like money, race, and gender and expression and such, because sometimes when people hear the term construct, in other words, we've constructed it, they tend to think that we've made it, therefore it's not real. So let me be very clear. Particularly with race, it matters very little as to whether or not we have figured out ways to categorize these things and then, of course, made them a social kind, but it never is to insinuate that racism is not real. Just because things appear as constructs in our culture doesn't mean that, one, they may have a biological grounding or they may not. And I'm not here talking about anything particular as far as money, race, or gender expression. All I'm trying to say is that if we were to determine that there was something that affected us as human beings, maybe in the way that we express our genders, it has little to do with the fact that that is how it is in the world. So everything else that we attribute about those things are still real. So I don't want you to hear construct and therefore made up and therefore unreal. Those things would not go together. But let's leave it at this. If we're going to try to look here at personhood and we're going to attach dignity, to that personhood, then we have to ask ourselves, is personhood something that is of a natural kind, that reflects the natural order of the world? Or is it that of a social kind, that reflects the interests and the actions of those of us that inhabit the world? Another way to put this is to ask whether or not personhood is forensic or discovered. Now, forensic, for maybe some people in high school, might have been on a forensic team. It's often called or known as the debate team. But forensic means that it's spoken. So this would be the social kind, or discovered. This is the natural kind. Now, I can't settle this here for you. It'd be very difficult for anybody to settle for themselves, but this is something that you will have to work through, and I'm just trying to give you the parameters. So if we're going to say that it's forensic, it's a social kind, then it behooves you to ask who will decide this, because there are always going to be somebody who says, well, this will count as a person and this will not count as a person. Now, in the next slide, we'll look at three, broad categorical ways, perhaps to determine personhood. But right now, I'm just trying to, set your thought pattern so you know how to start thinking about this. So if today you said, well, okay, how do we determine who is not a person? Just the fact that you say that means that somebody will have to decide. And one thing that we could at least be assured of, that if we were all in a room together, say there were 30 of us, and we were going to determine who was or was not a person, it's unlikely that we would put ourselves outside of that category. Okay, so we already know that this is going to be a favorable thing for the people who have the ability to make this decision. If we say it's discovered, and it's more something like lithium in human or vitamin C, that doesn't quite get us out of the woods either, because now we have to make some determination on how is this nature understood. Maybe not so much as to who would understand it, but how is it that we determine that this is an apple and that's an orange and this is a pitchfork and I'm a person? We're always going to have to work these things out one way or another. The reason why this is so important in morality and all the things we do is because morality is always for persons. Let me just be clear that this doesn't mean that we should be unethical to non-humans, say animals, which quite frankly some of the higher primates, there are philosophers that consider them persons, but we're not going to get into that debate right now. We'll leave it at this. Just the fact that there are zebras and horses and such doesn't mean that because they lack personhood, therefore they have no respect. But the difference is that we don't hold them accountable. So even though we may all love a dog as a pet, when a dog, say, has an accident in the house because it didn't go outside in time, we might react and say bad dog, but we don't really mean bad dog, because bad and good, these are moral qualities, and the dog is simply following its inheritance. What is that inherited? It's an act, so it has no control over these things. We, on the other hand, as persons, we can bring rationality to bear, so we're not simply susceptible to our instincts. We can rise above our instincts. This is why we hold each other culpable. When somebody does something wrong, you murder this person, you stole that, you raped this individual, therefore there's a law to protect the dignity because you had responsibility for it, because there was a freedom to act otherwise. Well, with animals that are instinctual, if they have no freedom to act otherwise, then we can propose an ethical treatment of them, but we don't hold them morally culpable. So the dignity that is typically associated with being morally responsible is always tied to this idea of personhood. So this is why we can't get around this. And no matter what we are doing, whether this is environmental ethics, whether this is business ethics, or whether this is medical ethics, is this the motivation? Now, let me just say something about that real briefly. If we were to look at medical ethics, physicians and nurses and such could simply follow protocol. They could do their job. That would keep the patient at least minimally safe. So no harm would come. They would at least try to do their good and respect and autonomy to a certain degree, and justice. There's the four principles. But we would want something a little bit higher as a motivation. If somebody were teaching our children in school, we don't want them to do the bare minimum and simply feel like they have to do this because this is their job. We know that there are principles in place and protocol that'll keep them from going outside the line, but we want more than guardrails. We want them to be invested in what they're doing. So we have to ask ourselves, is personhood tied to dignity? Is that the motivation for why somebody acts in a moral way. So we'll leave it at this, and these are the three things on the next slide we'll look at. If we're going to say dignity is pinned to personhood, where is it derived from? Is it because of a capacity that a human life has? Is it a value that we place on a human life? Or is personhood as that dignity always present wherever there is a human life? That's what we'll try to get to the bottom of. Now, again, this is something that philosophers always do, is by starting, at what they would at least try to understand the foundational concept before they move out. Most people move out into making some sort of ethical evaluation. You ask the average person, what makes you you? And they might even find that a little silly. If they took it seriously, they would find it very difficult to try to come up with a response for. So this is what we're doing. If we're going to agree that we're all living humans, this idea of personhood is something that makes us uniquely us, and makes me distinct from you and you distinct from others. So I want you to try to at least play through this as a, nothing more than, let's say, an activity. If we were to say that we'll agree everybody is a living human, but in order for that living human to be determined a person, it has to have particular capacities. In other words, it must have the capacity for memory. So maybe it would be okay. A 2-month-old may not have memory per se. We could argue that it does when it sees, like, the mother's face or such. But we also would have to try to determine exactly how this plays out with an individual in a permanent vegetative state. So we're going to have to say, is this concept, memory, is this going to be something that is a required capacity for us to say who is or is not a person? The same thing with consciousness. In the last lecture, we saw there were at least 2, if not 3, that maintained this was not just necessary, but a sufficient sufficient criteria for the human person. Now, consciousness is not an easy thing to define, but if we leave it at self-awareness, that an individual knows that they are separate from everything else in the world, it typically is held to occur around 5 or 6 months of age, which would leave us with, from the moment of fertilization to that point, human lives that are non-persons. And then, of course, once a person loses their consciousness permanently or even in a temporary state, they too would have to give up their concept of personhood. We'll leave it at that. As far as communicative, I'm just saying here that we need some ability to respond to others, let them know what we want, and be able to reciprocate if they were to respond to us. Intentionality, there's a bit of a will here at play, in a sense that it's not just a person makes a choice, but they can make the choice that I want this. An animal may act instinctively to get out of a way if it sees something falling or another animal coming at it. But we have intentional stances towards things in the world. Now, these are not just the only 4. All I'm trying to say is, we have to start making a list if we're going to say that we'll accept human and life as quantitative aspects of an individual, but as far as personal, which is qualitative, if we're going to determine it by capacity, we're going to have to determine what these things are. With value, maybe a way to understand this is literally by saying, what is it that we value of a human life where we would no longer deem this person, this individual, to be a person? It's hard for us to get around this language. Now, I'm not trying to be crass or silly about this, but if an individual were to go to a sperm bank for whatever reason, and the woman wants to purchase frozen sperm in order for her to become impregnated through IVF or insemination, whichever it is, without me trying to sound glib, they would not say, I will take whatever. They're going to have certain questions that they want to know, and one of them may be health issues. In other words, is the person who donated this, do they have any abnormalities that I should know about? Do they have any, physical issues that I should know about? Propensity for cancer in their family? Were they smokers? there's going to be a lot of questions that are asked. Um, Now, where I'm going with, at least with this, with health issues, is that we have to not be morally schizophrenic, thinking that we would go into a sperm bank asking for certain criteria that we valued as important for personhood, and then to look out in the public world, and when we see those individuals, perhaps not something in the back of our heads to at least diminish that and say they're less of a person than if they didn't have that. I just want you to think about this. We also value autonomy. So how would a paraplegic be held in our eyes? We would be aghast to think that we would consider themselves not a person, but do we not at least maybe perhaps reduce the person of that? I'm thinking of a veteran, that a video I saw or photograph where he came from Vietnam, and he was basically only had the body from the waist up, and some younger soldiers were saluting him. Now, we see this individual who may lack basically a severe amount of autonomy, or there is an individual, Paul, I can't remember the last name right now, who has been in an iron lung for some 40-some years. So he's basically just has a head sticking out of this metal, container, and everything must be done for him. Lacks total autonomy. So that might even bring up the third one. To what degree must we be able to interact with the world? What if we were, both deaf and mute, and if we were individuals that had no mobility? I'm thinking of a Muslim in L.A. I read an article about, called Muhammad Bozique, I think. I might be wrong in the last name. And he has an arrangement with the local hospital that he takes any terminally ill, abandoned children. So he may have them for a day, he may have them for a year. And one time he was, at least in the article I read, he was holding this young girl who was deaf and blind and had no ability to communicate, and he would just hold her and feed her and constantly stroke her hair. And when they asked him, why would you do this, he says, I have no other way to let this young lady know that Allah loves her. She has no ability to interact. The only thing that she does on her own is sort of swallow and digest. And that would bring us up with the last one, at least I have listed here. And again, these aren't comprehensive. Body integrity. At what point will we think that life has lost its value? Maybe that's a way to understand it. But what I'm trying to drive out with, again, by losing parts of our body or even functions of our body and such, if we were to make a list of what values are necessary to be present for personhood to exist alongside the quantitative understanding of life and human, what would they be, and who would decide that? If we were going to talk about a thing having a nature, so this would be more like the essentialist aspect of it, I just want to quickly point out two terms before I briefly explain this graphic. The term potential and actual in philosophy have very specific meanings. Actual is that what the thing is now. That seems quite straightforward and sensible to us. But potential, we hear that as like you or I might have potential. So there's some, a myriad of possibilities that are out there for us. That's not what potentiality means within metaphysics. Potential is the only possibility of the thing. So, for instance, it's the inherent power within what is actual to become the other thing, whatever it is that's next. So now let me talk about this acorn. If I were holding an acorn in my hand, I would say the acorn has its actuality as an acorn. Within this acorn is the potentiality of a sapling. Now, what I mean by that is its only potentiality. And yes, it is true that the acorn may never germinate, or I could destroy it. So just because a thing has a potential doesn't mean that potential will ever be realized. But it doesn't have any other potential. The acorn will not become a zebra. It only has this sapling that it can become. If I'm holding the sapling now, say a 2-foot sapling, that is the actuality. But it still has a potentiality, and the potentiality is to become a tree. And if it became a tree and I were standing underneath its branches, I would say this is the actuality of the tree. Those are all accidents. Accidents, again, they are not mishaps. They are the thing by which we know something, but they're the non-essential aspects. So you or I may lose hair, we could be maimed, or we might lose an arm. We could just start picking it, the skin color, all the color of eyes. All those things are not essential for what we are, or who we are. In this sense, the acorn, the sapling, and the tree are all various aspects of the accidental changes that we've seen. But they always had one essence, and the essence was oak. An acorn can only ever become an oak tree. There's no other essence in it. Okay? So I hope that's a little illustrative. So let's just use this now. Let's put it to the human person. If you have a fetus, and here you could do anything. You could do oocyte, blastocyst, doesn't matter. That's the actuality. And it only has one potentiality, and it's become a toddler. Now, the reason why it's important here is because regardless of where you sit on this particular, like what we call the abortion maternal life issue, people misuse the word potential here. You hear some others say it has the potentiality to become a human. There is no generic species. This is just logic. So there's not a generic life form that can become human, giraffe, or oak. That's it. It only has one potentiality, and the potentiality is built within the actuality of the fetus. If it makes it through birth and becomes a toddler, that is also not the end of it. The actuality of the toddler still holds the potentiality of becoming adult, and then the adult has that actual expression. But this is all accidental changes, just like the acorn, the sapling, and the tree. But in the same way that the oak was always the essence of the acorn, the sapling, and the tree, human is always the essence of the fetus, the toddler, and the adult. So if you are going to say personhood is attached to this, then wherever there is a human life, you have a personhood. The challenge for that is that it is not reliant on any capacity, and it's not reliant on any value, but it is, since it is present from the moment of fertilization until natural death, in order for somebody to be ethically consistent, you then would have to act towards persons in that way. So these are the three broad categories, at least how I'm presenting them here. It's enough for us to work through this. And you can't move into ethics until you start to say what a thing is. Until you know what this thing is, you can't move it on. If you say it is a human life, then you must say further, how do you understand personhood? And then once you understand personhood, then the moral evaluations can be applied. Now, this brings up an interesting question. If there are living humans that are not persons, now, if you, and I've already spoken that I don't like slogans being used as arguments, but if you would ascribe to the United States legal notion that personhood begins at birth, and by birth it's when the head evacuates the vaginal cavity. So if the child came breech, arms, legs first, it's not until the head is outside. Then it would not be a person prior to that. So you would have any unborn as a non-living human. And depending on how you were giving that capacity or value, that would apply somewhere at the end of life too. So you'd have to kind of work that out. And I'm not here to try to force feed how one should go on this, only to say that you need to determine this one way or another. Now, if you say that there are living things that were human but are no longer human, or we're not recognizing their humanity, we would call this the dehumanization. Dehumanization, which is not what we're talking about here, but it always results in genocide. So think of the atrocities that have happened in our world just in the 20th century, right? The Jewish Holocaust, the rape of Nanking, Rwanda, genocides. As a matter of fact, in Rwanda, I remember they referred to the Tutsis as cockroaches. So do you see how they took away their humanity? Because then you're just killing cockroaches, you're not killing humans. And also the Romanian Holocaust was also always not well known, but a large atrocity, to say the least. Now, more to the point here, if you have a living human that's not a person, we'd call that the depersonalization. this always results in subjugation, one way or another. So we have slavery as it's been not just in the United States, but all throughout the world. When one people subjugates another, they don't stop thinking of them as humans. All slaves were thought of as humans, but they were not thought of as persons. So they were subjugated and therefore depersonalized. Rape is that way too, because in a sense, the individual who's being raped is desecrated. Their personhood is removed. You even see this in hostage situations. Sometimes, at least, the way it plays out in cinema, that the person who's trying to negotiate with the hostage taker always tries to get them to see the hostages as persons, because the minute that they do, it starts then that I cannot do this, I cannot subjugate. It's also something that even in terms of rape, the rapist has to depersonalize them in their mind. So somehow the humanity might remain, but the idea of personhood is gone. All right, so we started out, at least this slide, by saying what makes you you. So now I'll ask it in a different way. Who decides what makes you you? Something has to happen here. We can't leave this up to people who have power, whether that be capital or whether that be prestige, because they will always place themselves in the category of person, whether it's capacity or value or nature would certainly cover it. So this is something that we have to work through. And as we move through the course and we start applying our moral ethical analysis to various problems, we have to consider by what virtue do we understand this living human to be a person. Thank you for listening.